I met one individual in a pub in Dublin, and I think it was our third meeting arranged. He finally turned up. He was so terrified to be seen talking about this. He had turned up the 2 previous times, and he had looked at me from a distance, but he hadn't actually been able to come up and speak to me. And I would go away after about an hour, realising he wasn't going to turn up, and he would ring me and apologise and set up a meeting again, and eventually I managed to meet him, and he unfolded a tale of absolute horror and rejection. He had actually told, but rejection at every level in terms of a lack of belief of his story.
When Mary finally plucked up the courage to complain, she quickly learned just how powerful the Catholic Church actually was.
I never told anybody until I told my doctor 25 years later. And the second person I told was my husband, and the third person I told was my local curate, who believed me, but said he thought I'd probably tempted the poor priest and didn't want to do anything about it, and told me I was forgiven. And that devastated me because, you know, I had spent so many years and work with this psychiatrist trying to be convinced that it wasn't my fault, and then this man of the church who I respected told me I was forgiven and it had probably been my fault. So that devastated me. So for another 10 years I never told another soul.
10 years later, the Father Brendan Smith scandal emerged, and Mary felt compelled to ensure McGuinness wouldn't abuse again.
I went to the Gardaí, and another year went by, and the diocese were telling me one thing, that they were cooperating with the guards and they'd given them all the information. I'd go to the guards and they'd say, no, they haven't been cooperating. And then when I'd go back to the diocese and say, look, the guards are telling me a different story, instead of admitting they'd been lying to me, they went to the Garda Commissioner and told him that this guard shouldn't have been telling me these things. Made a complaint against the guard for telling me the truth, because it was catching them out in lies. It was an extraordinary, arrogant attitude.
Mary reported McGuinness to the office of the Dublin Archdiocese in 1995. A year later, she came face to face with Cardinal Desmond Connell for the first time.
Well, I met with Cardinal Connell, and I wanted to know, it was nearly a year since I'd reported him, and I, reported Paul McGuinness and his abuse, and he was in a parish on the north side, and he was looking after the confirmation classes in the school, and I wanted to know why he hadn't been taken out of the parish immediately, and why he was still being allowed access to the children, when they knew what he had done. And the Cardinal said all the things he said, which was, we couldn't ruin his life, and it was a long time ago. And I said, but he's an abuser. And he said, oh, you can't call him an abuser. And he'd have to be proved guilty in a court of law before we could take any action. I got all these things, and I could not believe. And then I brought the Green Book up, which was only that year published. And I said, but in the Green Book it says, your own guidelines, it said he should be taken out of his parish and reported. And he said, well, they're only guidelines. They don't have any power in civil or canon law, so, I don't have to follow them, sort of thing. And yet he had said publicly that he was following them. So the private and the public was quite different. And at that point it was when I decided I really this man had to be convicted in court, because if he wasn't, they were going to leave him in a parish and leave him in touch with children. And he was still abusing at that point. I discovered later, at the time I was told there was nothing on the file, but I've discovered later that his abuse in Crumlin Hospital had been discovered quite soon after my own case. He had sent photographs to England to be processed, and Kodak over there had sent them to the guards here because they were abusive. And the guards had given them to Archbishop McQuaid, and he had disciplined Father McGuinness at the time. I don't know what the discipline was. It was a little slap on the wrist and told him not to do it again or whatever. But that was all on his file. And there had been, in fact, you could almost say, well, being so long ago, maybe it was in a different file or something. But in fact, the youth club in his current parish at that time had reported him the previous in 1994, only 18 months earlier, because they were concerned about contact he was having with children in the parish and the type of contact he was having. So as recently as 18 months, or only a year before I'd reported him, he'd actually been reported by his current parish. So it wasn't a question of they thought he was pure as the driven snow. They knew he wasn't, but they were determined not to let it get into the courts. And I really don't know that they wanted to protect him. I think they just wanted to protect the institution from the scandal of it. I don't think they were terribly worried about him either.
Mary claims that the deceit didn't end there.
Ken Riley and I, two victims, in December 2002, we had a 5-hour meeting with Cardinal Connell, Auxiliary Bishop of Dublin, the Chancellor at the time. A long, long meeting in Archbishop's House because we were calling for his resignation. And the country at that time was ready to march for his resignation. And some of the things we discussed at that, we discussed support, training for the support people who'd been put in place when the Green Book came out, support people for the abused. We discussed the training. And we spent a half an hour talking to these men about how the training could be improved, etc. And they sat there and they talked about how we might do this and how we might do that. We discovered a few months later, there were no training, there were no support people. These people didn't exist. And yet they sat there and talked to us about these non-existent people and how we were going to improve their training. It was total deceit. They didn't exist. And yet we were allowed to sit there and believe they did, and in all good faith talk about how their training could be improved. And yet they did not have any support people in place for victims. They had abandoned the idea back in '96. How deceitful can you get? But it worked because we agreed to work with the church, and Cardinal Connell's call for his resignation was withdrawn.
You know, going back, you're talking about the 3 or 4 previous archbishops of Dublin, going back indeed to John Charles McQuaid, because we know that he covered up for one particular abuser, Paul McGuinness. Information came to him in the 1960s and he covered it up. In fact, ironically, it was the guards that went to him and asked him for his advice as to what they should do with this particular abuser, which gives a really clear insight into the nature of Irish society in the 1960s and where the power lay at that time.
Andrew first told a teacher about his abuse while in 5th year at school. The teacher told the Archdiocese, and a few months later Father Ivan Payne was moved from Cabra to Sutton in Dublin. Almost a decade later, he approached Bishop Dermot O'Mahony.
I think I was in 5th year, and so maybe the abuse was over at 2 years, maybe by now, but I was very depressed and very unhappy, and I told a school teacher everything that had happened. Or I told him a fair amount of it, you know. And Ken Duggan was his name, and he was the guidance counsellor in the school. Very, very nice teacher, very approachable. And so I went to have a chat with him. And I wasn't sure when I was going to see him that I was going to tell him. I was just going to see him and tell him I wasn't too well. And but I told him, and he handled it very well. And we chatted, and he said he would like to go to Archbishop's House on my behalf and make a complaint about this. So I went along with that, and he went to Archbishop's House. Took a bit of while to get some feedback, but after a couple of months thereabouts, it was confirmed that Father Payne had accepted that my allegations were true, and the church would handle things from there on in. And so we left it there. I heard no more from the church about that. And a few months later, Father Payne was still in Cabra. So even though I wasn't really going around to the church very much, I was still seeing him. And I said this to Ken Duggan, and he went back to Archbishop's House and said, when you take this, you know, this is embarrassing and it's uncomfortable. And they said they would move him when they were moving, when they came to the time of the year when they normally moved priests, because they didn't want to draw attention onto him being moved at a time when they wouldn't normally move priests. So there's an early example of putting the priest before the victim.
In the early 90s, Andrew decided to sue Father Ivan Payne. The case was settled out of court, and Andrew received the equivalent of €35,000. He says the church did everything it could to frustrate the proceedings.